Johnny Carson was halfway through a joke about airline food when a violent gagging sound shattered the laughter in Studio One. A woman in the third row was clutching her throat, her face turning purple as she stood up desperately trying to breathe. The Tonight Show cameras kept rolling as 300 audience members watched in frozen horror. But what Johnny Carson did in the next 45 seconds would stun even the paramedics who'd been handling emergencies for 20 years. The king of late night was about to perform a medical procedure on live television that would save a stranger's life while 20 million Americans witnessed Johnny Carson become something more than an entertainer. March 8, 1977. The Tonight Show was cruising through its 11:38 p.m. segment with the smooth precision that had made Johnny Carson the undisputed kings of late-night television. NBC Studio One in Burbank maintained its exact 72-degree temperature while Johnny delivered his third joke in a series about the new airline deregulation proposals. He wore his favorite charcoal gray suit with the subtle pinstripe, the one his wardrobe supervisor said made him look authoritative yet approachable, paired with a burgundy tie that caught the tungsten lights perfectly. The audience of 300 had already erupted in laughter 4 times in the opening 6 minutes, a Tuesday night record that Johnny mentally noted with satisfaction. Ed McMahon occupied his designated position stage right, his booming laugh punctuating each punchline with metronomic reliability. Doc Severinson's band had just finished their opening number, a jazzy arrangement of Fly Me to the Moon that seemed prophetic given Johnny's aviation-themed monologue. The trumpet section's brass instruments still radiated heat from the performance, creating subtle waves in the air visible only to the camera operators who knew every quirk of Studio One's atmosphere. Everything was unfolding with the clockwork precision that had characterized 3,127 episodes without a single medical emergency requiring Johnny's direct intervention. The monologue that evening centered on President Carter's latest energy crisis speech, mixed with observations about California's drought restrictions. Johnny had rehearsed 12 jokes that afternoon, adjusting his delivery on joke number 8 to emphasize the word rationing for maximum comedic impact. The audience included a mix of tourists from Nebraska, Johnny's home state, which always got special attention, 2 rows of contest winners from a Los Angeles radio station, and in the third row, center section, a group of local restaurant workers who'd received last-minute tickets when a corporate group canceled. The show was tracking to beat their March ratings average. Fred de Cordova stood in his usual spot in the wings, stopwatch in hand, nodding approvingly as Johnny hit each mark perfectly. The rhythm was impeccable. Setup, punchline, wait for laugh, reset. This was the Tonight Show at its finest, the well-oiled machine that had dominated late night for 15 years. The sound that cut through Johnny's setup for joke number 9 wasn't subtle. It was a harsh, strangled gagging that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. At exactly 11:41 p.m., Johnny's hands, which had been gesturing to illustrate a point about airplane safety demonstrations, froze mid-motion. His eyes, trained after 15 years to scan audiences for reactions, immediately locked onto row 3, center section, where a woman had shot up from her seat, both hands clutching her throat in the universal sign for choking. Her face, which had been pink with laughter moments before, was rapidly transitioning through red to a dangerous purple hue. The woman, later identified as Margaret Sullivan, a 43-year-old restaurant manager from Glendale, was making desperate, airless gasping sounds that the overhead boom microphones picked up with horrifying clarity. Her body was bent forward slightly, her mouth open in a silent scream for air that wouldn't come. The people seated immediately around her had recoiled instinctively, creating a circle of empty space that made her distress even more visible to the entire studio. A piece of hard candy, one of the complimentary peppermints NBC provided to audience members, had lodged perfectly in her windpipe during a laugh. Johnny's microphone hit the Tonight Show desk with a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly silent studio. 300 people sat frozen, their laughter dying in their throats as they processed the shift from comedy to crisis. The camera operators, trained to follow Johnny's every movement, suddenly didn't know where to point their lenses, at Johnny, at the choking woman, or away from what might become a tragedy. Fred de Cordova's stopwatch fell from his hand, clattering on the concrete floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Ed McMahon half rose from his chair, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his usual hi-yo completely forgotten. Doc Severinson's band members stood with their instruments hanging uselessly at their sides. The entire Tonight Show machinery, the perfect system that had operated flawlessly for thousands of episodes, ground to a complete halt as Margaret Sullivan's face darkened toward unconsciousness, her knees beginning to buckle. Johnny Carson vaulted over the Tonight Show desk, not walked around, not stepped carefully, but launched himself over it with an athleticism nobody knew the 51-year-old possessed. His leather dress shoes hit the studio floor running, covering the 30 feet to row 3 in seconds that felt like hours. Margaret Sullivan was now bent completely forward, her face a deep purple blue, tears streaming from bulging eyes as her body fought desperately for oxygen that wouldn't come. She had maybe 30 seconds before unconsciousness, maybe 90 seconds before brain damage, maybe 3 minutes before death, all while 300 people and 20 million viewers watched helplessly. "Move back! Give her space!" Johnny commanded, with a voice nobody had heard before, not the smooth entertainer's tone, but something sharp and military, a remnant of Lieutenant Carson from his Navy days. He positioned himself behind Margaret, and what happened next shocked everyone, including the NBC medical staff watching from the wings. Johnny Carson knew exactly what to do. His arms wrapped around Margaret's midsection, his right fist positioned perfectly against her abdomen, just above the navel and below the ribcage. His movements were precise, practiced, automatic. The Heimlich maneuver had only been widely publicized for 3 years. Most people in 1977 had heard of it, but never seen it performed. Johnny executed it perfectly. One sharp upward thrust, nothing. Margaret's weight sagged against him. A second thrust, harder, lifting her feet slightly off the ground. Still nothing. Her body was going limp, the fight leaving her as oxygen deprivation took hold. Studio audience members were crying, some covering their eyes, others praying audibly. The Tonight Show cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of what might become a death on live television. "Come on, Margaret, stay with me," Johnny said directly into her ear, his voice picked up by his lapel microphone. "One more. We're going to get this." The third thrust was violent, powered by desperation, and suddenly a peppermint shot from Margaret's throat like a bullet, flying 6 feet through the air and striking a camera lens with an audible click. Margaret's body convulsed with a massive, ragged inhale, the sound of life returning amplified throughout the studio. Johnny Carson didn't release Margaret Sullivan even as she gasped and coughed, her body shaking with the effort of pulling oxygen into traumatized lungs. Instead, he carefully lowered her to the Tonight Show's floor, kneeling beside her while maintaining support of her head and shoulders. His charcoal suit was already ruined with Margaret's tears and saliva, his burgundy tie askew. But Johnny's focus never wavered from the woman whose life he'd just saved. "Keep breathing, slow and steady," Johnny instructed, his voice calm but firm. "Doc," he called to Severinson, "get her some water. Ed, call the paramedics now and tell them we have a conscious, choking victim who needs evaluation." The audience remained frozen until Johnny looked up at them, his face showing a mixture of relief and residual fear. "She's okay," he announced, his voice carrying through the studio. without need for a microphone. She's breathing. The explosion of applause and crying that followed was unlike anything the Tonight Show had ever witnessed. Not performance appreciation, but raw emotional release. Several audience members were sobbing openly, others hugging strangers, everyone processing what they'd nearly witnessed versus what Johnny had prevented. Margaret's first words, gasped between coughs, were picked up by the boom microphones. "You saved my life." Johnny's response revealed his humanity. "I nearly lost you there for a second, Margaret. You scared the hell out of me." His hands were visibly shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He stayed on the floor with her, using his pocket handkerchief to wipe her face, talking to her quietly about her breathing, asking her name, where she was from, keeping her conscious and calm while they waited for medical help. 2 NBC pages appeared with cushions from the Tonight Show's guest couch, creating a makeshift support for Margaret. Johnny never left her side, one hand on her shoulder monitoring her breathing. When she tried to apologize for disrupting the show, Johnny's response was immediate and genuine. "Margaret, you didn't disrupt anything. You reminded us that some things are infinitely more important than punchlines." The studio paramedics who'd been stationed backstage rushed out, but Johnny remained in position, only moving back slightly to give them access while maintaining eye contact with Margaret. The Burbank Fire Department paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, bursting through the Tonight Show's studio doors with their equipment, but they stopped short when they saw the scene. Johnny Carson was still on the studio floor beside Margaret Sullivan, who was sitting up, breathing normally, sipping water that Doc Severinsen had brought in a Tonight Show coffee mug. The lead paramedic, Tom Rodriguez, would later tell reporters he'd never arrived at an emergency where a celebrity had already performed successful intervention. "We usually find chaos," Rodriguez said. "Instead, we found Johnny Carson monitoring her pulse, like he'd been trained in emergency medicine." Within 15 minutes of the choking incident, NBC's switchboard exploded with 22,000 calls, people wanting to know if the woman survived, offering to pay her medical bills, and amazingly, asking for Johnny to teach the Heimlich maneuver on television. The network executives watching from the control booth made the unprecedented decision to keep broadcasting, despite the show's complete departure from format. This wasn't The Tonight Show anymore. It was something else, a moment of life and death that had transformed Johnny's stage into something sacred. Johnny finally stood when the paramedics had Margaret on a stretcher, ready for transport to St. Joseph's Hospital for examination. His appearance was shocking to regular viewers. The usually immaculate host looked disheveled, his gray suit wrinkled and stained, his perfect silver hair mussed, his hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline. He walked alongside Margaret's stretcher to the studio exit, holding her hand as she repeatedly whispered, "Thank you." The cameras followed this procession, capturing Johnny not as the king of late night, but as a human being who just pulled another human from the edge of death. When Johnny returned to the stage 3 minutes later, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted 90 seconds. Johnny stood at his desk, not behind it, visibly emotional. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I need to be honest with you. That was the most terrifying 3 minutes of my television career, but Margaret is going to be fine." He paused, collecting himself. "We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, honestly, I don't know what we're going to do. Jokes seem pretty insignificant right now." Over the following 6 months, Johnny Carson's save of Margaret Sullivan triggered a nationwide movement that nobody had anticipated. The American Red Cross reported a 400% increase in Heimlich maneuver training requests within 2 weeks of the broadcast. Dr. Henry Heimlich himself appeared on The Tonight Show 3 weeks later, demonstrating his technique with Johnny, creating what became the most watched public health segment in television history. Johnny and Margaret performed the demonstration together, with Margaret insisting on playing the victim to show others how it felt from both perspectives. That segment was copied onto 50,000 VHS tapes and distributed free to schools nationwide, funded entirely by Johnny personally. Margaret Sullivan became an unexpected advocate for first aid training, traveling with Johnny to 12 cities where they conducted free public training sessions. Johnny would open each event with the same line: "I'm not a doctor. I'm just a talk show host who happened to know what to do when it mattered." Together, they trained over 100,000 people in what became known as the Carson Initiative. The Surgeon General credited their efforts with saving at least 40 documented lives within the first year. People who survived choking incidents because someone had watched Johnny save Margaret. The Tonight Show implemented mandatory first aid training for all staff, crew, and even frequent guests. Johnny funded this personally, bringing in military medics to teach the same emergency response techniques he'd learned in the Navy. Every Thursday, 30 minutes before taping, the entire Tonight Show team would run emergency drills. Johnny participated in every session, often playing the victim to help others overcome their hesitation about physical intervention. Fred de Cordova later revealed that Johnny had confessed he'd nearly frozen that night, saved only by muscle memory from military training decades earlier. NBC's insurance company studied the incident and mandated emergency medical personnel at all live broadcasts, but Johnny went further. He established the Sullivan Fund at St. Joseph's Hospital, providing free emergency care for anyone injured or becoming ill at public events. Margaret, who recovered completely, returned to The Tonight Show annually on March 8th for 5 consecutive years, each time bringing statistics about lives saved through the training programs they'd inspired. The Margaret Sullivan incident exposed layers of Johnny Carson that 30 years of public life had carefully concealed. During a 60 Minutes interview 6 months later, Johnny revealed something that stunned even his closest associates. He'd been secretly maintaining his emergency medical certification since leaving the Navy in 1946, taking refresher courses every 2 years at UCLA Medical Center under an assumed name. "I always had this fear," Johnny admitted to Mike Wallace, "that someday, somewhere, someone would need help, and I'd be the only one there. The thought of being helpless in that moment terrified me more than bombing on stage ever could." Former Navy colleagues came forward with stories about Lieutenant Carson that reframed everything. During his service on USS Pennsylvania, Johnny had saved 2 sailors from drowning after a cargo net accident, earning a commendation he'd never mentioned publicly. He'd trained as a medical corpsman backup, learning emergency procedures that became ingrained in his muscle memory. Johnny saw death up close in the Pacific, revealed former shipmate Robert Henley. He made a promise to himself that he'd never be unable to help again. That's why he vaulted over that desk. It wasn't thought. It was 30 years of preparation meeting its moment. The Tonight Show staff began sharing observations they'd kept private for years. Johnny arrived at the studio 3 hours early every taping day, and they discovered he spent part of that time in the NBC medical office, reviewing emergency procedures with the on-site nurse. He'd quietly paid for CPR training for every Tonight Show employee, from camera operators to janitors. His dressing room contained a fully stocked medical kit that he personally maintained. The commanding presence that emerged during Margaret's crisis wasn't an anomaly. It was Johnny without the entertainer's mask, the military officer who'd never really left active duty. The most revealing moment came when Margaret Sullivan asked Johnny during their 5th anniversary appearance why he'd really saved her. Johnny's answer, delivered without his usual deflection or humor, defined him. "Because Margaret, in that moment, you weren't an audience member, and I wasn't a talk show host. You were a human being who needed help, and I was a human being who could provide it. Everything else, the cameras, the show, the consequences, disappeared. That's what we're supposed to do for each other." The Carson Sullivan incident, as medical journals termed it, became the most studied celebrity intervention in emergency medicine history. The New England Journal of Medicine published a frame-by-frame analysis of Johnny's Heimlich technique, using the Tonight Show footage as the gold standard for proper execution. Medical schools incorporated the video into their curriculum, with UCLA Medical School creating the Carson Response Protocol for public emergencies. By 1985, an estimated 2.3 million Americans had learned the Heimlich maneuver specifically because of Johnny's save, with the American Heart Association crediting the incident with normalizing emergency intervention by bystanders. The Tonight Show studios were retrofitted with medical equipment that became the industry standard: emergency stations every 50 feet, automated external defibrillators before they were widely available, and a dedicated medical professional for every 100 audience members. Johnny personally funded identical upgrades at 20 smaller television stations that couldn't afford them. The Carson Standard, as insurance companies called it, became mandatory for all live audience events by 1980, affecting everything from Broadway theaters to sports arenas. The economic impact was substantial, but the human impact was immeasurable. Over 500 documented saves at public venues within the first decade. Margaret Sullivan established the 3 Minutes Foundation, named for the critical time Johnny spent saving her life. The foundation provided free first aid training in underserved communities, with Johnny serving as honorary chairman and primary benefactor. By 1992, when Johnny retired from The Tonight Show, the foundation had trained over 1 million people. Margaret appeared at Johnny's final show, presenting him with a plaque containing 3 numbers: 1 million trained, 10,000 documented saves, and 1, the number of times Johnny Carson had to overcome his own fear to save a stranger. St. Joseph's Hospital created the Carson Sullivan Emergency Response Wing, funded jointly by Johnny and Margaret, becoming the first facility specifically designed to train civilians in emergency intervention. The wing's entrance featured a bronze plaque with The Tonight Show's NBC Peacock logo and the inscription, "In memory of the night entertainment became heroism, March 8, 1977. Every paramedic and emergency room physician who trained there watched the original Tonight Show footage as part of their orientation. The Carson Sullivan moment illuminated a fundamental truth about human nature. In life or death moments, all artificial constructs of fame, wealth, and social hierarchy evaporate, leaving only one human being's capacity to save another. When Johnny Carson launched himself over that desk, he demonstrated that our most essential responsibility to each other transcends any role we play professionally. The audience's collective trauma and relief revealed our deep need to believe that someone would act if we were dying, that strangers would become saviors when seconds mattered. Johnny's response validated that faith in humanity's basic decency. The incident exposed society's dangerous assumption that someone else would always handle emergencies, the bystander effect that kills thousands annually. 300 people sat frozen while Margaret Sullivan died in front of them, paralyzed not by indifference, but by the assumption that surely someone else knew what to do. Johnny's intervention shattered that paralysis forever, proving that expertise matters less than action, that imperfect help beats perfect hesitation. The moral weight of his choice rippled through American consciousness. If Johnny Carson could risk everything to save a stranger, what excuse did anyone have for inaction? The spiritual dimension transcended religious boundaries entirely. The image of Johnny Carson cradling Margaret Sullivan's head while she fought for breath became iconic. Wealth comforting vulnerability, fame serving anonymity, power protecting powerlessness. Philosophers wrote about the Carson moment, that instant when a person must choose between self-preservation and human duty. The fact that Johnny chose humanity while 20 million people watched transformed entertainment into moral instruction. Every viewer had to ask themselves, would I have jumped over that desk? Perhaps most profoundly, The incident revealed our collective hunger for authentic human connection in increasingly isolated times. The audience's tears weren't just about Margaret's survival. They were about witnessing love between strangers, about seeing proof that we matter to each other even when we've never met. Johnny's trembling hands, after saving Margaret, showed that caring has a cost, that heroism hurts, that saving others requires us to risk parts of ourselves. The Tonight Show's comedy had made millions laugh, but Johnny saving Margaret made millions believe in each other.